Actually, we're reading, or we're going to look at all of 1 Samuel chapter 13 and all of 1 Samuel chapter 14. But it's too long a reading. The thing is, like so many Old Testament stories, they actually span a number of chapters. And so I'll do my best to tell the story so that we know the story, and then we're going to see what we can learn from it. For those of you that are on the ball, which I'm guessing is all of you are wondering, why has he deviated from his series that he was doing? Because you all know the series that I was doing. You was all expecting another one of Jesus, the highlights in Jesus' ministry. And so, because I'm sure that question is baffling you all, it was on all of your minds, wasn't it? Yeah. The reason we're doing this is because as we come up to those couple of weeks when we're doing some outreach on the estate, and then in August where we'll be doing some more outreach, it was this story really that inspired what we'll be doing. And so I thought it would be good to speak from it, because next week I'm not here and then we're sort of into the mission time, so there wouldn't be another opportunity, so I thought I'd do it this week. This is a great story, okay? This is one of those absolutely delicious stories that you can just feast on, and it's got so much in it for us to learn from. And hopefully, if at least you learn the story and the main point, there'll be something that you can keep coming back to and learning from. So 1 Samuel chapter 13, first to tell the story, I'm just going to read various verses as we work through to build up the picture. So 1 Samuel chapter 13, we're told in verse 2 that Saul, he was the first ever king of Israel. Okay, so God led them out of slavery, the nation Israel. He led them out of slavery in Egypt. They crossed into the promised land. That took 40 years when God delivered Israel from Egypt and delivered them into the promised land. Then when they first inherited their land, they didn't have kings. They had judges ruling over various provinces of Israel. But they wanted a king, like all the other nations. And so they went to Samuel and they said, give us a king. And in the end, they get Saul. Saul is the first ever king of Israel. And as we come to this chapter, we find that as a king and as a nation, they're in trouble, okay? And we read in verse 2, and this is all significant, okay? Saul, it says he chose 3,000 men from Israel. That's soldiers. He had 3,000 soldiers. That's not a lot of soldiers for a nation to have. 2,000 were with him at Michmash in the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah in Benjamin. And the rest of the men he sent back to their homes. Okay, so Saul's got 3,000 men. 2,000 are with him at Michmash, that's a place in Israel. Then about 7 miles south-east of that was his son Jonathan with the other 1,000. Okay, so 2,000 there with Saul, 1,000 there with Jonathan. That's about 7 miles, roughly 7 miles in between the two. And then we read Jonathan, in verse 3, attacked the Philistine outpost in Gibeah. So you've got Michmash there, and then Bethel there where Jonathan is. Right in the middle is this Gibeah that Jonathan attacked, okay, or roughly in the middle. So what's happened? Here's the picture. Okay, Israel is surrounded by the Philistines. They're the ones who are bullying Israel. They've been raping their land, they've been taking their crops and things like that. And they've managed to get a stronghold in Gibeah, right between Jonathan and Saul. And Jonathan goes with his men, attacks this outpost, and routs the Philistines. Okay? Well, you would think that Israel would be celebrating this, wouldn't you? Yes, he's routed the Philistines. He's overcome the outpost. But what we find is this in verse 3. We read, then Saul had the trumpet blown throughout the land and said, let the Hebrews hear. So all Israel heard the news. Saul, that means, basically their army, has attacked the Philistine outpost. And look at what it says. And now Israel has become a stench to the Philistines. And it says, and the people were summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. So now what's happened is rather than celebrating this victory, Saul is afraid. It's like if ever you sort of been in a situation when you was at school and there was a bully and they were sort of squaring up to you, you got to, the thing that, if you're afraid of this person, You might be afraid. It depends how you work, okay? My mentality was always this. If I thought there was going to be a fight, I thought I've got to get the first hit in. I didn't wait for them to hit me first because I knew if they hit me first, it was all over, okay? So, but some people are the opposite to that. They think if I hit them, they might get really angry on me, yeah? And so it's like, how can I get out of this? And that's what happens here. Saul is afraid. He says, we've made them really angry. They were already bad on us. Now, Jonathan, my son, has attacked their outposts. They're all angry. So he gets Jonathan and his army to join him at Bethel so that he's got a stronger army, 3,000 men now. And also, crucially, he's got his son Jonathan where he can keep an eye on him. Because Jonathan seems to be a bit of a loose cannon, just going out and attacking the Philistines. And so that's what's happened. And now, also, Saul was told by Samuel to wait for Samuel. Samuel was the priest, and Samuel was the one that brought the offerings to God, and that would bring God's favour so that they would win the battles, okay? Saul was a king, he wasn't the priest. Samuel said to Saul, wait until I get there, I'll bring an offering. Trust God, don't be afraid. We'll make the offering to God, and then we'll obey him, and if he says go to war, we'll go to war. But look at what happened. It says, Saul waited, in verse 8, 7 days, the time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. So there they are. They're waiting for Samuel. There's a mountain army all around them. Samuel doesn't come, and the men start getting afraid, and it says they start to scatter. That's a disheartening situation to be in, isn't it? It's like, what do? I'm losing men. The longer I leave it, the weaker we get. And if we leave it too long, we're going to be stuffed. And so, this is what Saul does. He says in verse 9, so he said, bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings. And Saul, didn't wait for Samuel, Saul offered up the burnt offering. Just as he finished making the offering, Samuel arrived. And Saul went out to greet him. So he didn't wait for Samuel. He did what he shouldn't have done because he wasn't the priest. He made the offering. Just as he finishes, Samuel turns up. You can imagine thinking, damn, why didn't I wait? Just a few more moments. But Samuel turns up. And this is what Samuel says. He says to Saul, what have you done? What have you done? Saul replied, when I saw the men scattering, and that you did not come at the set time, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me and at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favour. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering. And Samuel says, you acted foolishly. Now, he acted foolishly because what he wasn't doing is he wasn't trusting God's way. There's a lesson for us in that, isn't there? There he was afraid. We can understand his fear. His army was scattering. We can understand him thinking, and they might attack any time. And he was taking that kind of thought, we better get ready because, if they attack and we haven't already sought God's favour, we're going to be in trouble. So you can understand his fear. But the problem is, he was one of God's people. Do you know, as God's people, we never need to fear, no matter what it looks like. And Saul should have just kept trusting God. Yeah, my army's scattering, but we've got a great resource in God. But he didn't. He thought, I better intervene and do something. And so he did. And that's why Samuel says, you acted foolishly, and there is a serious price to pay. He says, you have not kept the command of the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now, your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him leader of his people because you have not kept the Lord's command. And then Samuel went up to Gibeah and it goes on to the next part of the story. So Saul there, okay, so get the picture, okay? There is Saul. His army scattering, the enemy is mounting their forces. He's in desperation. He's made an offering that he shouldn't have made. Samuel turns up and tells him, because you've done that, God has found a better leader than you, a leader who's going to trust me. So now he feels like now I know I haven't even got God's favour. How am I going to lead all these people who are scattering? Okay. And then we read, the next part is really, really important as well, because As if that's not demoralising enough. Okay, this is what we read in verse 16. Saul and his son Jonathan and the men with them were staying in Gibeah in Benjamin while the Philistines camped at Michmash. Raiding parties went out from the Philistine camps in 3 detachments. One turned to Ophrah in the vicinity of Shaul, another toward Beth Horon, and the third toward the borderland overlooking the valley of Zeboim, facing the desert. So they're getting surrounded. And this is what it says, okay, about Saul's army. Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel because the Philistines had said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears. So leading up to all this, somehow the Philistines, they've got some sort of control over the nation. And they've made sure that they haven't got any blacksmiths so that they can't make any weapons. So all Israel went down to the Philistines, this is what had been happening, to have their plowshares, their mattocks, their axes and their sickles, all their farming utensils sharpened. And the price was 2/3 of a shekel for sharpening plowshares and mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening forks and axes and for repointing goads. And here's the significant bit. So, on the day of battle, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or a spear, except Saul and his son Jonathan. Okay, did you get that? So out of all of his army, nobody had any swords or spears apart from 2 people, Jonathan and Saul. Okay, they're the only 2 that have got a sword or a spear. So now, the picture that we're given is one of a depleting army. God's favour is gone. The Philistines, the enemy, are preparing to mount their attack. They're surrounding. And none of the Israelites have got swords. And that's why we read that the Israelites, did you pick it up as Lauren was doing the reading? They were hiding. Did you get that? When Lauren did the reading? They were hiding. It says they were hiding in bushes and in holes in the ground, in caves. In other words, if you went for a walk through the land at that time, you might hear a rustling in the bushes and you look, and there's a couple of Israelite soldiers hiding, not with spears and swords, but with a pitchfork kind of thing. They haven't got proper weapons. There's one in the ground hiding in a hole over there and another one in a cave over there. And they're hiding. And it said they were quaking with fear. Okay, so fear's overcome their army. So that's the situation. And then when we come to chapter 14, which is what we're going to be focusing on more, we come to another story about Saul, about Jonathan, that's Saul's son. Remember the loose cannon, who's now who Saul's keeping close to himself, Jonathan and his armour bearer. And so we'll pick this story up now. On each side of the pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistine outpost was a cliff. Oh, sorry, let me back up a little bit. One day, Jonathan, son of Saul, said to the young man bearing his armour, "Come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side," but he did not tell his father. Okay, so remember the last time he did this, he took his whole army and routed an outpost. His father's now got him close to his side, thinking, I've got to keep an eye on this guy. And this time, Jonathan says to his armour bearer, "Let's go and attack another Philistine outpost, or we won't tell my father." So they're sneaking off, just 2 of them. Okay? Now, Israel, they have got their backs against the wall. They've got by now, again it says in chapter 13, 600 men left. 600 men. Do you know, it's said about the Philistine army, they had 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and foot soldiers as numerous as the sand of the sea. Saul's got 600 men, and if my maths is right, 2 spears and 2 swords between him and Jonathan. So that's the odds. And now that means also that when Jonathan hatches this great plan, let's get to with his armour bearer, just he and his armour bearer are going to go and attack the Philistines. At most, they've got a sword and a spear between them. That's it. Okay? So, they decide they're going to attack these 2 in secret, this other Philistine outpost. On each side of the pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistine outpost was a cliff. One was called Bozez and the other Sina. One cliff stood to the north toward Michmash, and the other to the south toward Geba. And here, Jonathan announces his plan of attack. Okay, now get this. Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised fellows," that's the Philistines. "Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." And his armor-bearer says, "Do all that you have in mind. Go ahead, I am with you, heart and soul." So at this stage, the armor-bearer doesn't really know Jonathan's plan. You can imagine thinking, well, I trust this guy. Yeah, he's going to lead me, not us, just me, into a battle against this outpost. And he says, perhaps the Lord will give us victory. We may or may not return from this. Now, just so that you know the risk that they were taking, they didn't just risk being killed. What the enemy would do, particularly for Jonathan was royalty. What the enemy would do with royalty is when they were captured, they generally would, their aim was not to kill them straight away. They would first pluck out their eyes, cut out their tongue, strip them naked, then whip them with briars and thorns, seat them on a donkey backwards and parade them through their city while they got pelted until they were executed. To completely humiliate them. So Jonathan was thinking, if this goes belly up, I'm going to have my eyes plucked out, my tongue cut out, sat on a donkey completely naked, whipped, and then pelted before being executed. That is why very often what they would do is they would make sure they fell on their own swords so that didn't happen to them. That's what kings often did. So this is a massive risk. But Jonathan, don't worry, he's got a plan. And the armor-bearer is thinking he must have a plan because he wouldn't take this kind of a risk. So, verse 10, if you've got a Bible, do read it with me. From verse 8. Jonathan said, "Come then, we will cross over toward the men, and here's the plan, and let them see us." Now, I'm already thinking, I'm not sure about this plan. Okay, if I was going to get into a situation, a fight or something, with a bunch of guys, and there's more of them, and they are harder than me, what I would do is I'd probably get like a big lump of metal and sneak up behind them, wouldn't you? What I wouldn't do is just say, "Here I am, come and get me," okay? But this is his plan. We will cross over toward the men and let them see us. If they say to us, "Wait there until we come to you," we will stay where we are and not go up to them. Okay, so that's the plan. That's not much of a plan, is it? It's like what he's saying is, when they see us, if they say, "Kate, wait there," we'll wait here. That's the plan. That is it. Okay? But there's another half to the plan. But if they say, "Come up to us," we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands. Now so think of what he's saying. If they say climb up, we'll climb up, because that's the sign the Lord's given them into our hands. In other words, if they say wait there, then we're done for. That's it, yeah? That's no sign there, but we'll wait here anyway, and they're going to come and pluck out my eyes, cut out my tongue, stick me on a donkey, beat me up and everything else. So there's their plan. What do you think of that plan? It's a rubbish plan. I could have come up with a better plan than that, I reckon. Okay? Now, the other thing is this. You notice he says, "Perhaps the Lord will give us victory." Did you notice that? It's not that God has said to him, "Jonathan, go to the Philistine outpost. I am going to give you victory. This is how you will know. You make yourself known to them, and then when they say, 'Come on up,' that will be your sign." That's not what's happened. He's taken a risk, a big risk. Okay? And then, so we move on in the story. So, verse 11, both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. "Look," said the Philistines, "the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes in the ground that they were hiding in." The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor-bearer, "Come up to us and we'll teach you a lesson." That's a crazy thing to say. I remember a certain guy used to be in this church, James. Some of you remember James. When his son would play up, he'd say, "Come here, son, and I will beat you." It's like, well, your son's not likely to come to you, for a beating, is he? But he didn't mean beat him. He was Nigerian. That's the way he used to speak. But you don't say an invitation to come for a beating. It's like, what? But that's what they say. "Come up here and we'll teach you a lesson." And this is what Jonathan does. So Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, "Climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." He's taking this risk now, so he's climbing up. And then, there's a detail here we don't want to miss. Jonathan climbed up, it says, using his hands and his feet, with his armour bearer behind him. In other words, they were climbing up such a steep hill, they had to use both hands and both feet. It wasn't a gentle slope. This is a proper steep hill. So they're going to get to the top, and there's going to be some Philistines there. Innumerable. Oh, actually, it's not. It's an outpost. But there's going to be a good number of them there. There's not much chance. So this is a dire situation. This is a crazy plan that is absolutely doomed unless the Lord intervenes. Jonathan climbed up using his hands and his feet with his armour bearer right behind him. Presumably, David was going to slay the first person. The armour bearer is going to pick up his sword, because at the moment he hasn't got one, and then join in the battle, I'm assuming. In that first attack, Jonathan and his armour bearer killed some 20 men in an area of about half an acre. Then panic struck the whole army, those in the camp and in the field, and those in the outposts and the raiding parties, and the ground shook. It was a panic sent by God. Saul's lookouts at Gibeah in Benjamin saw the army melting away in all directions. Then Saul said to the men who were with him, "Muster the forces and see who has left us." Now, it seems to me that he's doing what he did before. This isn't a courageous thing. He's thinking, oh my goodness me, someone's gone and done it again. Who's done it? When they did, it was Jonathan and his armour bearer who were not there. So he realises, Jonathan's done it again. What does he think he's doing? But then it says this: Saul said to Abijah, "Bring the ark of God." At that time, it was with the Israelites. While Saul was still talking to the priest, the tumult in the Philistine camp increased more and more. Then it says, so. In other words, the whole thing, the Israelites, the Philistines, they're completely defeated. They're killing one another and everything else. So Saul said to the priest, "Withdraw your hand." Then Saul and all his men assembled and went to the battle. So they wait until victory is sure, and then they join in. Okay? Then, they found the Philistines in total confusion, striking each other with their swords. Those Hebrews who had previously been with the Philistines, that's the Hebrews that had joined them. Do you remember it said some had even crossed the valley and joined? That had joined them, that had gone up with them to their camp, went over to the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. And when all the Israelites who had hidden in the hill country of Ephraim and heard that the Philistines were on the run, they joined the battle in hot pursuit. So the Lord rescued Israel that day, and the battle moved on beyond Beth Aven. So that's the story. So they have a great victory in the end. Okay, so you got that? So let's think about what we can learn from this story. The first thing is this: when we look at Saul, we see through and through a man who is looking at his situation, who's looking at the challenge, and that is all he's looking at. He's got no faith whatsoever, none. And in fact, when he does finally act, it's only when he can see with his own eyes that, we've got this. We're going to win this. Okay? There was no element of risk whatsoever, was there? There was no dependence upon God. God often puts us in situations where we are utterly dependent upon him so that we trust in him. Okay? All of us, that's going to happen to at times. You'll be in situations where your circumstances are outside of your control. You need to make a decision. You need to do something. You don't really know what to do. Well, you have to just trust God. That's the first thing. And that's the thing that Saul didn't do. Because he wasn't trusting God in the first place, everything is out of kilter. He's not in a position of faith thinking, I can trust God in this. What does he want me to do? And then on that basis, taking a risk. He was not trusting God and so taking things into his own hands. Do you see the difference? And so Saul is a great illustration for us of how no matter what things look like, we can trust God. And we've got to be very careful that we don't do what Saul does and just out of insecurity and fear, acting out of that. Because that never accomplishes God's purposes. In fact, that kind of faithlessness only ever costs us. Saul had the kingdom taken away from him. So now you can understand it, the circumstances were dire. But the dire circumstances did not justify his faithlessness. So often, with Christians, what happens is they find themselves in a situation and they do something they know they shouldn't really do. And when you ask them, why did you do that? They say, well, I had to do it because of X, Y, and Z. Well, we never, ever have to act in faithlessness. But keep trusting God, no matter what. Keep going with him. Keep walking with him, and he will always be faithful, and his ways will bring you into victory of one kind or another. So that's Saul. But when we look at Jonathan, we see someone quite different. And I want to focus really on a few things. The first thing is that Jonathan knew that the way that the nation Israel were in that situation was hopeless. He knew that because there was nobody acting in faith, he knew that God wasn't going to use anyone. Because God always works with people on the basis of faith. Always. Now, I'm not saying that God cannot work in other ways. He can just intervene at any time. But as a rule, he works with faith. So when he looks at a company of people, if no one is exercising faith, taking steps, then God's not going to work with those people. And Jonathan knew that. We've got to trust God. And as he looked around, he saw that none of God's people were trusting God. And it's harder, isn't it, to trust God when no one else is? Jonathan took a step. It says he didn't tell his father. His father was the leader of Israel. But he knew he couldn't tell his father because his father would say, that's just stupid. That's just going to make a mess. That's what are you thinking? You're going to get us into trouble. That's all he'd have got from his father and probably from everyone else in Israel. He knew that none of them had faith at all. And so he had to do what he did without telling his father. And that's a sad state of affairs, isn't it? Now, you imagine that was the case for you. I don't know if ever you feel like this, but sometimes as a Christian, I wonder, is it true? I wonder that sometimes. And you look around at the world in which we live in, and you look at all over this country, how many people believe that Jesus is Lord? Very few, right? And that, if we're looking at numbers, can undermine us if we're not careful. Jonathan didn't do that. He didn't look around and think, actually, no one's got any faith, maybe I shouldn't have faith. He knew his God. He kept trusting in the Lord. And the Lord is faithful in that situation. So, welcome, guys. So Jonathan keeps faith, okay? He doesn't throw in the towel with the rest. And then the other thing is this. Of all Israel, there's one man, it seems, with faith. And here's the thing. That is enough for God. That's all it takes. Isn't that amazing? One person to act in faith. God will use that. In fact, God's pleased to use that. The other thing that we notice about Jonathan is he didn't have resources. He had an whole army to defeat, but he didn't have any resources. And he didn't even have a good plan, did he? And that tells us what? It tells us that our progress in God, our advance in his purposes, is not about the things that we can do. Now, it's good to look at what we've got and make the most of what we've got. That's exactly what Jonathan did. He said, we've got one sword and we've got a spear, and I've got one guy with me. And he made the most of what he had. He took a risk with what he had. So I'm not saying that we don't use our resources. But what I am saying is this. We're fully aware that our resources aren't really going to achieve anything. Our own human resources are not going to achieve anything great for God. There are, look at our number here. 10,000 people in Moulsecoombe. Even if we've got really good resources and we're really skilled and everything else, how are we going to impact 10,000 people, let alone the rest of Brighton? It's a joke. But we make the most of our resources, what we've got, but our trust is in the Lord. Jonathan said that the Lord is able to save by many or by few. Okay? And I think he really believed that. And here's a question for us. Do you believe that? Do you believe the Lord can save by many or by few? Let me put that into a more concrete kind of frame. do you believe that we've got enough people here in our church to have an impact on Moulsecoombe? Do you believe that? I mean, it's great if you do. Imagine you're going to war, there's only a few of you, and you still believe this. The Lord can save by many or by few, right? We all believe that, yeah? So does that mean when you look around, if you've got an army of about 150 against an army of 10,000, are you going to be wanting more people? Are you going to be saying, I don't think we should do this? Really? I think at that point, our faith gets tested, doesn't it? Well, yeah, I know the Lord can save by many or by few, but if we have a lot more people, then we can be sure, right? Isn't that how we think? If we're honest, it's very easy for us to sit in a room like this and say, yeah, I believe the Lord can save by many or by few. But when it comes to it, would we be the ones that go out on our own like Jonathan, risking everything? Huge risk. Would you risk that? What if, the risk is you could get really hurt? Then suddenly, oh no, I want a few troops around me. And I want to be right in the middle of them. I don't mind going out with them, but I want to be right in the middle so that, all the foot soldiers on the perimeter, they all get slaughtered and hopefully it'll never quite get to me. I think, that's where a lot of the time our faith is at. But not Jonathan. He had a courageous faith. When he said the Lord can save by many or by few, remember? The first attack of the Philistine outpost, he had 1,000 men with him. When he went into that battle with 1,000 men, I don't think he was saying we need all these people to win this battle. I think he was saying the Lord can save by many or by few. It's not the number, let's just go anyway. And that was proved true when he goes out of just him and his armor bearer. He really believed it. He didn't just say he believed it. That's an amazing thing, isn't it? An amazing faith. So he takes the risk. The other thing is this, he's got nothing to lose, has he? I mean, the army is going to be defeated anyway without any faith. So he's like, I might as well do something for God. I haven't got a great plan. I can't really, and God hasn't said he'll do this or that, but I'm just going to put myself out there. I'm going to take a risk for God because it's that, or we just sit with all the fearful and the naysayers. So he takes a risk for God. And God gives him victory. So it's not about the plan, it's not about the resources, it's about faith. A faith that is prepared to take risk at genuine potential cost to self. That's the real faith, trusting in God. And what he trusted in when he had faith, it wasn't God's promise because God hadn't made a promise about it. It was in God's character. But he reasoned like this, even if God doesn't give us victory, because there's no guarantee, I'm prepared to give my life for it. Anyway, you see? He was willing to give his life, even if it didn't achieve the ends. It's better, it's a bit like he was thinking, when I cross that finishing line, when I go through that ticker tape of my life and I come into God's kingdom, I want to be running as hard as I can. I want to give everything I've got. And whatever happens on earth, I know that I gave everything. That's a good attitude. So it doesn't depend on resources, doesn't depend on numbers, it depends on faith and trusting in God, taking a risk, even at a risk of cost to self. And then we've got the rest of Saul's army. Again, look, just think about the picture. 2 men take a great risk. God brings about a victory, and then all of Israel, suddenly they got a bit of metal in their backs, all of a sudden. Okay, so now they're up for the battle, and they all go in and they loot the Philistines and they get all the victory. Do you know, that's a great picture for us as well. Because when we think about all this whole story, who do you identify with? I want to encourage you to either be like Jonathan, who was a great leader full of faith and was prepared to take risks, or be like the armor bearer, who was a great follower full of faith, prepared to take risks. We can't all be leaders, and the real hero's got to be that follower, isn't it? He didn't even have a sword, okay? So, be a great follower or be a great leader. So I want to encourage us to think, I want to be like one of those guys, whichever is more fitting. But when we identify with them, isn't it true that probably we're with Saul and his lot? That's probably the truth. So much of the time, that's where we're at. But before we despair, this is a wonderful picture of another victory, of the Lord Jesus, when he went, not with two of them, on his own. And when he went and took on all the powers of darkness, Satan and all the powers of darkness, took upon himself the sin of the whole world, confronted death and defeated it. And nobody stood with him, no one. And yet in his victory, what does he do? He generously shares it with all the fearful and the weak, those who are hiding in holes, those who were nowhere, had no faith whatsoever. He shares it undeservedly. Just like, you can imagine Jonathan and his armor bearer saying, off it, you lot, you're not having any of this bounty. But no, they all got to share. You see, we are more like those other soldiers. We'd like to be like Jonathan, and I want to encourage us, let's go for that, let's do that, or like the armor bearer. But there's a bigger picture here, that we are recipients of an amazing victory of the Lord Jesus. Now, where that really applies to us in all that we do is here. He's already won the victory out there. So whenever we go and do any kind of mission, whenever we take risks, really we're just being like Saul's army, going in after the battle's been won. And that's a place of sure victory. That's a good place to be, isn't it? We can trust in the Lord Jesus. Let's just close our eyes for a few moments.